The quiet suburban morning was shattered by a frantic call to 911. Mrs. Eleanor Abernathy, a sweet elderly woman who lived next door, had found Mr. Peterson lying motionless in his beloved rose garden. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the squad car radio as Officers Miller and Jones raced to the scene. Mr. Peterson, a retired school teacher known for his prize-winning roses and friendly demeanor, was a pillar of the community. He was always willing to lend a hand, whether it was helping with neighborhood cleanup days or tutoring kids after school. The thought that something terrible had happened to him sent a chill through the small town. As the officers approached the Peterson residence, the yellow police tape already cordoned off the backyard. Mrs. Abernathy, visibly shaken, was being comforted by another neighbor. The air was thick with the sweet scent of roses, a stark contrast to the grim reality that lay hidden amongst the colorful blooms. Officer Miller, a seasoned veteran with years on the force, ducked under the tape and entered the garden. The scene was chaotic, yet strangely peaceful. Mr. Peterson lay sprawled near his prized peace rose bush, his gardening gloves still on. A small trowel lay discarded nearby. But something was terribly wrong. A dark stain bloomed on his chest, staining his favorite gardening shirt a horrifying crimson. Officer Jones followed closely behind, his eyes scanning the perimeter. He noticed something immediately, a muddy footprint, clearly visible in the soft earth near the rose bushes. It was a large print, and the tread pattern seemed unusually deep and complex. He carefully marked the area with evidence flags, knowing that this small detail could be crucial in solving the mystery. The paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. Mr. Peterson was gone. The garden, once a symbol of life and beauty, had become a scene of death. The officers exchanged grim glances, knowing that their work had just begun. They had to find out who would want to harm such a beloved member of their community. The investigation started right there, amongst the roses, with a single, muddy footprint as their first clue. The quiet morning was now filled with the sounds of sirens and the murmur of investigators, all searching for answers in the peaceful garden-turned-crime scene. The initial shock of discovering Mr. Peterson's body quickly gave way to the methodical process of securing the scene and gathering evidence. Officer Miller, being the senior officer, took charge, directing the other officers and ensuring that every detail was documented. The backyard was now a hive of activity, with investigators carefully combing through the garden, photographing every item, and collecting potential evidence. The first priority was to establish a clear perimeter. Yellow tape was extended to encompass a wider area, preventing any unauthorized access and preserving the integrity of the crime scene. Officers were stationed at the entrance to the backyard, carefully logging everyone who entered and exited. This meticulous approach was crucial to avoid contaminating any potential evidence. The forensic team arrived shortly after, their presence adding a layer of somber professionalism to the scene. Dressed in white protective suits, they moved with deliberate precision, their eyes constantly scanning for clues. They began by photographing the body from multiple angles, capturing the position, the wounds, and any surrounding objects. The trowel near Mr. Peterson's hand was carefully bagged and tagged, as were the gardening gloves he was wearing. The muddy footprint was of particular interest. A forensic technician carefully photographed it, using specialized lighting to highlight the intricate details of the sole pattern. A plaster cast was then made of the print, preserving its three-dimensional form for later comparison. The surrounding soil was also collected, as it might contain traces of other materials that could provide valuable clues. Meanwhile, other officers began interviewing neighbors, trying to piece together Mr. Peterson's last known movements. Mrs. Abernathy, still visibly distraught, recounted how she had seen Mr. Peterson tending to his roses the previous evening. She said he seemed happy and had even offered her a freshly cut bloom. Other neighbors confirmed his friendly nature and his dedication to his garden. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the investigation continued. The backyard, once a peaceful sanctuary, was now a stage for a grim drama. Every detail, no matter how small, was scrutinized, analyzed, and documented. The officers knew that solving this case would require patience, diligence, and a keen eye for detail. The muddy footprint, the discarded trowel, the neighbor's accounts, all these pieces of the puzzle had to be carefully assembled to reveal the truth behind Mr. Peterson's tragic death. The initial chaos was slowly giving way to a structured, systematic search for justice. As the interviews progressed, one name kept surfacing: John. John lived next door to Mr. Peterson, on the other side from Mrs. Abernathy. Several neighbors mentioned that John and Mr. Peterson hadn't always seen eye to eye. There were hushed whispers of arguments over property lines and loud music late at night. Officer Miller decided it was time to have a chat with John. John's house was a modest bungalow, much like the others on the street, but the lawn was overgrown and the paint was peeling. As Officer Miller approached the front door, he noticed a pair of muddy work boots sitting on the porch. He made a mental note of them. John answered the door with a wary expression. He was a stocky man, with a gruff demeanor and a nervous twitch in his left eye. He seemed surprised, but not overly so, to see the police at his doorstep. "Mr. John Smith?" Officer Miller asked, holding up his badge. "Yeah, that's me," John replied, his voice a low rumble. "We're investigating the death of Mr. Peterson next door." "We were hoping you could answer a few questions," Officer Miller explained. John hesitated for a moment before reluctantly stepping aside to let the officers in. The inside of the house was cluttered and smelled faintly of stale beer. John gestured towards a worn-out armchair. "So, what's this about Peterson?" John asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "We understand you were neighbors," Officer Miller began. "Yeah, we were. Didn't really know him, though. Just the old guy next door who liked his roses," John said, avoiding eye contact. Officer Jones, who had been quietly observing John, spoke up. "Some neighbors mentioned you two had some disagreements in the past." John's face hardened slightly. "Look, everyone has disagreements. It's no big deal. We just had different ideas about things." "What kind of things?" Officer Miller pressed. "Just property stuff. He thought my tree branches were hanging over his yard." "Stupid stuff, really." John shrugged, trying to dismiss the issue. But the officers could sense the tension in the room. John was definitely holding something back. His nervous twitch seemed to intensify. He kept glancing towards the window, as if expecting someone to appear. It was clear to the officers that John was far from being just a casual neighbor. He was a person of interest, and they needed to tread carefully to uncover the truth. The muddy boots on the porch suddenly seemed a lot more significant. Back at the crime scene, the forensic team was meticulously analyzing the evidence they had collected. The plaster cast of the muddy footprint was carefully transported to the lab, along with samples of soil and the gardening tools. Every piece of evidence was handled with the utmost care, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. Dr. Emily Carter, the lead forensic scientist, examined the footprint under a powerful magnifying glass. She noted the unusual wear patterns and the intricate design of the sole. It wasn't a common pattern, it had distinct grooves and ridges that made it unique. She knew that if she could find a matching sole, it would be a significant breakthrough in the case. Meanwhile, the soil samples were being analyzed for any foreign substances. Microscopic traces of pollen, plant fibers, or even chemicals could provide valuable clues about where the suspect had been before entering Mr. Peterson's garden. The gardening tools were also being examined for fingerprints and traces of blood. The lab was a hive of activity, with scientists working diligently to extract every possible piece of information from the evidence. Dr. Carter knew that time was of the essence. The sooner they could identify a suspect, the sooner they could bring justice to Mr. Peterson and his grieving family. As Dr. Carter continued her examination of the footprint, she had a hunch. She pulled up the database of shoe sole patterns, a vast collection of designs from various manufacturers. She started searching for patterns that resembled the one from Mr. Peterson's garden, carefully comparing each detail. Hours passed, and the search seemed fruitless. But Dr. Carter was determined. She knew that the key to solving the case lay in that muddy footprint. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she found a potential match. It was a rare pattern used on a specific brand of work boots. The pattern was almost identical to the one from the crime scene, but there was one crucial difference: a small, almost imperceptible nick in the heel. Dr. Carter zoomed in on the image, her heart pounding with anticipation. Could this be the break they needed? She carefully compared the nick to the cast from the crime scene. They matched perfectly. A wave of excitement washed over her. They had a solid lead. Now, all they needed to do was find the boots. And they already had a suspect in mind: John, the nervous neighbor with the muddy work boots on his porch. Dr. Carter immediately contacted Officer Miller, knowing that this new information could change everything. Officer Miller received Dr. Carter's call with a mix of anticipation and grim satisfaction. The news about the matching boot print confirmed his suspicions about John. He immediately relayed the information to Officer Jones, and they agreed to return to John's house. This time, they wouldn't be asking questions, they would be collecting evidence. As they approached John's house, Officer Miller noticed that the muddy work boots were still sitting on the porch, exactly where he had seen them earlier. He instructed Officer Jones to secure the perimeter while he knocked on the door. John answered the door, looking even more nervous than before. He seemed to sense that something had changed. "What do you want now?" he asked, his voice laced with apprehension. "Mr. Smith, we need to take your boots for further examination," Officer Miller stated firmly. John's eyes widened. "My boots? What for?" "We believe they may be connected to the crime scene," Officer Miller replied, keeping his tone neutral. John hesitated, then tried to feign ignorance. "Look, I don't know anything about any crime scene. I just wear those boots for yard work." "We understand, Mr. Smith. But we still need to take them." "It's a standard procedure," Officer Miller said, holding out his hand. John reluctantly went inside and returned with the boots. He handed them over to Officer Miller, avoiding eye contact. Officer Miller carefully placed the boots in an evidence bag, ensuring that they were properly sealed and labeled. "Is there anything else?" John asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Just one more thing, Mr. Smith. We're going to need you to come down to the station with us for further questioning," Officer Miller said. John's face paled. He knew he was in trouble. He had tried to play it cool, but the evidence was mounting against him. The muddy footprint, the unique sole pattern, and now, the boots themselves, it was all pointing in one direction. As the officers led him to the patrol car, John knew that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling around him. The quiet suburban street, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, had become a stage for his downfall. The weight of his actions was finally catching up to him. The ride to the police station was silent, filled only with the dread of what was to come. Back at the forensic lab, Dr. Carter and her team were eager to examine John's boots. They carefully removed them from the evidence bag, taking precautions to avoid contaminating any potential evidence. The boots were immediately placed under a high-powered microscope. Dr. Carter began by comparing the sole pattern of the boots to the plaster cast taken from Mr. Peterson's garden. She meticulously examined every groove, ridge, and wear pattern. The match was undeniable. The boots had the same unique sole pattern as the footprint found at the crime scene. But it was the small nick in the heel that sealed the deal. The nick on John's boot matched the nick on the plaster cast perfectly. "We have a 100% match," Dr. Carter announced to her team, her voice filled with a sense of triumph. The evidence was irrefutable. John's boots had left the bloody footprint in Mr. Peterson's garden. The forensic team then turned their attention to the mud caked on the boots. They carefully collected samples and analyzed them under a microscope. The soil composition matched the soil from Mr. Peterson's garden. There were even traces of the same type of rose fertilizer that Mr. Peterson used on his prize-winning roses. The boots were also examined for traces of blood. Using specialized chemicals, the forensic team was able to detect minute traces of blood on the soles and sides of the boots. The blood was collected and sent to the DNA lab for analysis. The DNA results came back quickly. The blood on John's boots matched Mr. Peterson's DNA. There was no doubt in anyone's mind. John's boots had been at the scene of the crime, and they had been covered in Mr. Peterson's blood. Dr. Carter prepared a detailed report, outlining all the forensic evidence that linked John's boots to the crime. The report was sent to Officer Miller, who was waiting anxiously at the police station. The evidence was overwhelming. The unique sole pattern, the nick in the heel, the matching soil composition, and the presence of Mr. Peterson's blood, it was all pointing directly at John. The forensic evidence had painted a clear picture of what had happened in Mr. Peterson's garden that night. John's boots had walked on that ground, and they had left behind a trail of evidence that would ultimately lead to his conviction. The boots, once a seemingly insignificant detail, had become the key to unlocking the truth. Officer Miller sat across from John in the sterile interrogation room. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a table and 2 chairs as the only fixtures. A one-way mirror allowed other officers to observe the interrogation without being seen. Officer Miller placed the forensic report on the table, the words, "Confidential," stamped in bold red letters. He looked directly at John, his expression serious. "Mr. Smith, we have some new information regarding the death of Mr. Peterson." John shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding eye contact. "What kind of information?" he mumbled. Officer Miller opened the report and began to read. "Forensic analysis has confirmed that the sole pattern of your work boots matches the bloody footprint found in Mr. Peterson's garden. The match is 100%. John's face paled. He remained silent, his nervous twitch becoming more pronounced. Officer Miller continued, "Furthermore, the soil on your boots matches the soil from Mr. Peterson's garden, and traces of Mr. Peterson's blood were found on your boots." John finally looked up, his eyes filled with fear. "That's not true," he stammered. "I don't know anything about that." "Mr. Smith, the evidence is overwhelming," Officer Miller said, his voice firm. "Your boots were at the scene of the crime, and they were covered in Mr. Peterson's blood. Can you explain that?" John shook his head frantically. I can't explain it. I don't know how that happened." "Mr. Smith, we believe you were involved in Mr. Peterson's death," Officer Miller stated bluntly. "We believe you were in his garden that night, and that you had a confrontation with him." John remained silent, his eyes darting around the room. He was trapped. The evidence was insurmountable. He knew that his carefully constructed lies were crumbling around him. "Mr. Smith, we want to give you an opportunity to tell us your side of the story," Officer Miller said, softening his tone slightly. "Tell us what happened in Mr. Peterson's garden that night." John hesitated for a long moment, then finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean to do it." The interrogation had begun. The detectives were about to delve into the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. The hard part was over. Now, they just needed to listen. "Didn't mean to do it?" Officer Miller repeated, his voice incredulous. "Mr. Peterson is dead. He was stabbed in his own garden. How do you not mean to do that?" John hung his head, his shoulders shaking slightly. "It just happened," he mumbled. "Tell us what happened, John," Officer Jones urged, his voice calm and reassuring. "We need to know the truth." John took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice barely audible. "I went over to his house that night, to talk to him." "What did you want to talk about?" Officer Miller asked. "The tree," John replied. "His stupid tree. It was blocking the sun from my garden. I asked him to trim it, but he wouldn't listen. He said it was his tree, and he could do whatever he wanted with it." "So you went over there to argue about a tree?" Officer Jones asked, raising an eyebrow. "It wasn't just about the tree," John said, his voice becoming more agitated. "It was about everything. He always looked down on me. He thought he was better than me just because he had a nice garden and a fancy house. Did you argue with him? Officer Miller pressed. Yeah, we argued, John admitted. It got heated. I told him he was a selfish old man, and he told me I was a worthless bum. And then what happened? Officer Jones asked, his eyes fixed on John's face. John hesitated, his breathing becoming ragged. I don't know, he stammered. I just lost it. I grabbed the trowel, and He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. You stabbed him, John, Officer Miller said, his voice cold and unwavering. You stabbed Mr. Peterson in his own garden. John began to sob, his body racked with guilt and remorse. I didn't mean to, he cried. It was an accident. I just wanted him to listen to me. An accident? Officer Miller scoffed. You stabbed him in the chest with a gardening trowel. That's not an accident, John. That's murder. John continued to sob, his confession pouring out in a torrent of tears and remorse. He described how he had gone to Mr. Peterson's house with the intention of arguing with him, but that the argument had escalated into a violent confrontation. He admitted to grabbing the trowel and stabbing Mr. Peterson in a fit of rage. He claimed that he hadn't meant to kill him, but that he had simply lost control. As John's confession drew to a close, Officer Miller and Officer Jones exchanged glances. They had their man. The forensic evidence, combined with John's confession, left no doubt in their minds. John Smith was the killer of Mr. Peterson. The quiet suburban street could finally breathe again. The detectives had brought justice to Mr. Peterson and closure to his grieving family. Before the confession, when detectives first questioned John, he offered an alibi that quickly unraveled. He claimed he had been home alone all night, watching television. He couldn't recall specific shows or channels, saying he was flipping through aimlessly. This vague account immediately raised red flags. Officer Jones went back to the neighborhood, revisiting the houses near John's. He wanted to see if anyone could corroborate John's story, even partially. He spoke to Mrs. Abernathy again, asking if she had seen or heard anything unusual that night. She hadn't. She usually went to bed early and didn't notice much activity next door. He then spoke to a teenager, a young man named Kevin, who lived across the street from John. Kevin was known for staying up late, playing video games. Officer Jones hoped he might have seen something, even a light on in John's house. Kevin remembered seeing John's living room light on, but he couldn't say for sure what time it was. He also mentioned that John often played his music loud, but he hadn't heard anything that night. It was a dead end. No one could confirm John's alibi. There were no witnesses to place him at home, and no evidence to support his claim of watching television. The lack of corroboration only strengthened the detective's suspicion that John was lying. The flimsy alibi, combined with John's nervous demeanor and the mounting forensic evidence, painted a clear picture of a man trying to conceal his guilt. It added another layer to the case against him, making his initial denials even more unbelievable. Later, after John confessed, the detectives revisited the alibi, understanding its true purpose, to deflect suspicion and create a false sense of security. The fact that it was so easily disproven highlighted John's lack of planning and his desperate attempt to avoid taking responsibility for his actions. It was a testament to the power of truth and the futility of lies in the face of a thorough investigation. Even a seemingly minor detail like an unconfirmed alibi can contribute significantly to building a strong case and bringing a killer to justice. The detectives knew that every lie John told only dug him deeper into the hole he had created for himself. Even after John confessed to the stabbing, the detectives continued to build their case, meticulously gathering every piece of evidence to ensure a conviction. They knew that a strong motive would further solidify their case in the eyes of a jury. During their initial interviews with the neighbors, several people mentioned that John had been struggling financially. He had lost his job a few months prior and had been having trouble making ends meet. Some neighbors also mentioned that Mr. Peterson, known for his generosity, had occasionally lent John money. Officer Jones decided to delve deeper into John's financial situation. He obtained a warrant to access John's bank records and discovered that John was heavily in debt. He had maxed out his credit cards and was facing foreclosure on his house. Further investigation revealed that John owed Mr. Peterson a significant amount of money. He had borrowed the money several months ago, promising to pay it back quickly, but he had been unable to do so. Mr. Peterson had been pressing John for repayment, and the two had argued about the debt on several occasions. The detectives also discovered a note in Mr. Peterson's personal belongings, detailing the amount of money John owed him and a reminder to follow up on the payment. This note provided concrete evidence of the debt and the ongoing tension between the two men. The detectives confronted John with this new information during a subsequent interrogation. They presented him with the bank records, the foreclosure notice, and the note from Mr. Peterson. John initially denied owing Mr. Peterson any money, but he eventually admitted to borrowing a small sum. However, he downplayed the amount and claimed that he had already repaid it. The detectives knew he was lying. The evidence was overwhelming. The debt, combined with John's financial struggles and the ongoing arguments with Mr. Peterson, provided a clear motive for the murder. It painted a picture of a desperate man driven to violence by financial pressure and resentment. The detectives now had not only the means and the opportunity but also a compelling reason for John to have killed Mr. Peterson. The circumstantial evidence, combined with the forensic evidence and John's confession, created an airtight case that would be difficult for any defense attorney to challenge. The detectives were confident that they had brought justice to Mr. Peterson and that John would be held accountable for his actions. As the interrogation wore on, the detectives noticed subtle but significant inconsistencies in John's story. At first, he had claimed the argument with Mr. Peterson was solely about the tree. But as the detectives pressed him, he admitted the debt had also been a factor. Initially, he said he grabbed the trowel in a moment of blind rage, unable to recall the exact sequence of events. Later, he described a more deliberate action, stating he picked up the trowel with the intention of scaring Mr. Peterson. This shift suggested a more premeditated act than he initially portrayed. He also changed his account of what happened after the stabbing. First, he claimed he ran straight home, terrified. But later, he admitted to pausing for a moment, watching Mr. Peterson fall, before fleeing the scene. This small detail hinted at a coldness and a lack of remorse that contradicted his claims of accidental manslaughter. Officer Miller, a seasoned interrogator, seized on these discrepancies. He knew that inconsistencies were a sign of deception, a crack in the facade of a carefully constructed lie. He pressed John on each point, forcing him to explain the changes in his story. John became increasingly agitated and defensive. He stammered and stumbled over his words, struggling to maintain a coherent narrative. He claimed his memory was hazy, that he was still in shock from the events of that night. But the detectives saw through his excuses. They knew that he was trying to manipulate them, to minimize his culpability and portray himself as a victim of circumstance. The changing story, coupled with the overwhelming evidence against him, further eroded John's credibility. It demonstrated that he was not being truthful, that he was attempting to conceal the full extent of his involvement in Mr. Peterson's death. The detectives knew they were getting closer to the truth, that John's carefully constructed lies were about to unravel completely. Each inconsistency was a step closer to justice for Mr. Peterson and his grieving family. The pressure was mounting, and John was about to break. The scene shifts. The bright, sterile interrogation room fades, replaced by the soft glow of twilight in Mr. Peterson's garden. It is the evening before the murder. John stands facing Mr. Peterson, his face contorted with anger. "I don't have it, Peterson." John shouts, his voice echoing through the quiet neighborhood. "I told you, I'll pay you back when I get my next paycheck." Mr. Peterson, his face etched with disappointment and frustration, stands firm. "That's what you said last month, John. And the month before that. I need that money. I have bills to pay too. Give me a break." John retorts, his voice rising. "You're not exactly hurting for cash. Look at this place. You're living the good life while I'm struggling to keep my head above water. Mr. Peterson sighs, his shoulders slumping. I've always tried to help you, John. I thought you were my friend. Friend? John scoffs. Friends don't hound each other for money. Friends help each other out. I did help you out, John, Mr. Peterson replies, his voice growing louder. I lent you that money when you needed it most. Now I need it back. Well, I don't have it. John explodes, his fists clenching. So get off my back. Mr. Peterson takes a step closer, his eyes blazing with anger. I'm tired of your excuses, John. If you don't pay me back by the end of the week, I'm going to take legal action. John's face turns crimson. You wouldn't dare, he snarls. Try me, Mr. Peterson retorts, turning his back on John and walking towards his house. John watches him go, his rage simmering beneath the surface. He clenches his fists tighter, his knuckles turning white. The camera focuses on his face, revealing a mixture of anger, desperation, and resentment. The scene fades back to the interrogation room. John sits hunched over, his face buried in his hands. The flashback has revealed the true motive behind the murder, a desperate attempt to avoid financial ruin and escape the burden of debt. The argument wasn't just about a tree or a petty dispute between neighbors. It was about money, power, and the simmering resentment that had been building between John and Mr. Peterson for months. The detectives now had a clear understanding of what had driven John to commit such a heinous act. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. Cornered and desperate, John attempted one last, desperate maneuver to deflect blame. He pointed the finger at another neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a quiet, unassuming man who lived across the street from Mr. Peterson. It wasn't me, John insisted, his voice regaining a sliver of its earlier conviction. It was Henderson. He always seemed jealous of Peterson's garden. I heard him say once that Peterson thought he was better than everyone else. Officer Miller raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Mr. Henderson? What makes you think he was involved? He's always been a strange guy, John said, grasping at straws. Keeps to himself. Never talks to anyone. And I saw him arguing with Peterson a few weeks ago. It sounded pretty heated. Officer Jones, skeptical, interjected, what were they arguing about? John hesitated, struggling to fabricate a believable scenario. I don't know exactly. But it was about something important. Henderson seemed really angry. The detectives exchanged glances. They knew John was grasping at straws, fabricating a story to shift the blame. They had already interviewed Mr. Henderson, and he had provided a solid alibi. He had been out of town visiting his daughter and grandchildren at the time of the murder. Furthermore, there was no evidence to link him to the crime scene. Officer Miller decided to call John's bluff. We've already spoken to Mr. Henderson, John. He was out of town. And no one else reported any argument between them. John's face fell. His last-ditch attempt to escape responsibility had failed miserably. He slumped back in his chair, defeated. Why would you try to blame someone else, John? Officer Jones asked, his voice laced with disappointment. Why not just tell us the truth? John remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. He knew he had run out of options. The evidence was overwhelming, his alibi had crumbled, his story was full of holes, and his attempt to shift the blame had backfired spectacularly. He had nowhere left to turn. The truth was the only option left. The detectives waited patiently, knowing that the confession was inevitable. John's desperate attempt to blame Mr. Henderson had only served to highlight his own guilt and desperation. It was the final nail in his coffin. Officer Jones, who had been quietly observing John throughout the interrogation, noticed something that had previously gone unnoticed. There were faint streaks of mud on the lower legs of John's trousers, almost obscured by the dim lighting of the interrogation room. The mud appeared to be the same color and consistency as the soil taken from Mr. Peterson's garden. He subtly signaled to Officer Miller, who feigned a coughing fit to distract John while Officer Jones discreetly moved closer to examine the trousers more closely. He carefully photographed the mud stains, taking care not to alert John to his actions. After a few minutes, Officer Jones rejoined Officer Miller, and they stepped out of the interrogation room to confer in private. "I think we have something," Officer Jones said, showing Officer Miller the photographs of the mud stains. "It looks like the same soil from Peterson's garden." Officer Miller nodded grimly. "Get those trousers to Dr. Carter right away," he instructed. "If that mud matches the soil from the garden, it's game over." Officer Jones quickly retrieved John's trousers, carefully bagging them as evidence and sending them to the forensic lab for analysis. Dr. Carter and her team immediately went to work, examining the mud samples under a microscope. The results came back quickly and were conclusive. The mud on John's trousers matched the soil from Mr. Peterson's garden perfectly. The detectives now had irrefutable proof that John had been in Mr. Peterson's garden that night, not only based on the footprint from his boots but also on the soil clinging to his clothing. Officer Miller and Officer Jones returned to the interrogation room, armed with this new and damning evidence. They placed the forensic report on the table, highlighting the section that detailed the mud analysis. "Mr. Smith," Officer Miller said, his voice cold and unwavering. "We found mud on your trousers that matches the soil from Mr. Peterson's garden. Can you explain that?" John stared at the report, his face ashen. He knew he was caught. There was no denying the evidence. He had tried to lie, he had tried to shift the blame, but the truth had finally caught up with him. The mud on his trousers was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence that sealed his fate. The detectives waited patiently, knowing that John was about to confess. The breakthrough had arrived. John stared at the forensic report, his face a mask of despair. The mud on his trousers was the final straw, the undeniable proof that shattered his carefully constructed lies. He knew he could no longer deny his involvement in Mr. Peterson's death. He hung his head, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Okay, I did it." Officer Miller and Officer Jones exchanged knowing glances. They had finally broken him. The truth was about to come out. "Tell us what happened, John," Officer Jones said, his voice calm and reassuring. John took a deep breath and began to recount the events of that fateful night. He described how he had gone to Mr. Peterson's house to confront him about the debt. He admitted that the argument had quickly escalated, fueled by years of resentment and frustration. "I didn't mean to kill him," John sobbed, his voice choked with emotion. "It just happened. I lost control. I was so angry, so frustrated. He wouldn't listen to me. He just kept telling me how worthless I was." He explained how he had grabbed the trowel, intending only to scare Mr. Peterson, to make him understand the depth of his desperation. But in a moment of blind rage, he had struck out, plunging the trowel into Mr. Peterson's chest. "It was a mistake," John cried, his voice filled with anguish. "A terrible, terrible mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear, I didn't." He described how he had panicked after the stabbing, fleeing the scene in a state of shock and terror. He had tried to clean his boots and hide his trousers, hoping to erase any trace of his involvement. But it was all in vain. The evidence had caught up with him. The detectives listened patiently as John recounted his story, meticulously documenting every detail. They knew that his confession, combined with the overwhelming forensic evidence, would ensure his conviction. As John's confession drew to a close, a sense of somber relief washed over the interrogation room. The truth had finally come to light. The mystery of Mr. Peterson's death had been solved. And John Smith, the killer, would finally be held accountable for his actions. The weight of the truth was heavy, but it was also liberating. The detectives had done their job. They had brought justice to Mr. Peterson and closure to his grieving family. The long and arduous investigation was finally over. With John's confession secured, the wheels of justice began to turn swiftly. He was formally arrested and charged with the murder of Mr. Peterson. The news spread quickly through the quiet suburban community, sending shockwaves of disbelief and grief. The Peterson family, devastated by their loss, began the long and arduous process of grieving. Mr. Peterson's wife, Sarah, was inconsolable. She had lost her beloved husband, her companion, and her best friend. Their children and grandchildren rallied around her, offering support and comfort during this difficult time. The community mourned the loss of Mr. Peterson, a pillar of their neighborhood. They organized a memorial service in his honor, celebrating his life and his contributions to the community. The service was attended by hundreds of people, all of whom had been touched by Mr. Peterson's kindness and generosity. As the Peterson family grieved, they also turned their attention to seeking justice for Mr. Peterson. They vowed to attend every court hearing, to ensure that John Smith was held accountable for his actions. They wanted to make sure that Mr. Peterson's death was not in vain, and that his killer was brought to justice. The trial of John Smith was a somber affair. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the forensic reports, John's confession, and the testimony of numerous witnesses. The defense attempted to argue that the stabbing was accidental, a result of John's diminished capacity due to stress and financial hardship. But the jury was not swayed. After deliberating for several hours, they returned a verdict of guilty. John Smith was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The Peterson family found some solace in the verdict, knowing that John Smith would spend many years behind bars. But they knew that no amount of justice could ever bring back Mr. Peterson. His loss would be felt forever. In the aftermath of the trial, the community began to heal. They remembered Mr. Peterson for his kindness, his generosity, and his love of roses. They vowed to keep his memory alive, and to carry on his legacy of service and compassion. The quiet suburban street, once shattered by violence and grief, slowly began to regain its sense of peace and tranquility. But the memory of Mr. Peterson, and the tragic events that led to his death, would forever remain etched in their hearts.